I think one of the elements that has been a lot covered during this workshop has been essentially this question of physical access, the availability of electricity. But in our experience, and we work mostly in middle-income countries, you have another dimension of this access problem, which is really linked to affordability. Because you may have the physical availability of electricity, and what we have examined and worked in preparation for the workshop today was to see what are the impacts of bringing in new sources of energy, cleaner sources of energy, renewable energy, what are the impacts that those have on tariffs, and therefore the impact that those have then on affordability. And so the work that we have done shows that in many cases, because of the distortions that you have, in the energy sector, sets of subsidies, for example, on heat, subsidies on fossil fuel, what you have is that in the short term and medium term, you do have an impact of renewable energy sources on the tariff. And therefore, if we want to ensure, that the shift of the mix in energy sources does not have, to buffer, if you want, the tariff impact to the lowest income populations that are users of electricity, we need to think about that in particular. And so, in the context of the workshop, we presented and discussed, if you want, some conclusions on that based on work we've done in countries where we work. Well, I think a range of conclusions. Number one, we do find that because of the current structure of costs, in other words, both of renewable energy schemes and of fossil fuel base, which are often again subsidized, we do find that at least in the 3 countries that we presented case studies on, you do have an impact. In other words, there is a positive impact, an increase, if you want, in the cost of supply, and therefore an increase in the tariff. The second point we found is that energy efficiency plays a big role. If countries introduce aggressive energy efficiency measures together with the renewable energy, you can actually more than compensate the increase in cost and tariff, that the renewable energy sources bring. Therefore, that's a very important conclusion, because it means that if you bring that composite package, if you want, you can actually more than absorb the incremental cost, that you have in the short term. And I think the third point that we find is obviously depending on the particular endowment of each country in terms of resources, then you have also differences. Countries, for example, that have a lot of hydro potential, may have much more flexibility to reach, if you want, a high renewable energy target than countries that do not have that potential. So that's a third element that we found in our work. Yes, what it is that in order, in practice, to see, I would say, apply this concept of affordability, we've come out with, I would say, relatively simple indicator, which is, one, you compute what is the likely evolution of the tariff, right? 2, you make a projection of what you believe household income will do over a certain period in the future, and then to a certain extent you make a ratio between these two. And what we've, in a way, used ourselves in the work on affordability is that if for electricity that ratio exceeds 10%, then it is useful to look at potential schemes in order for that lowest income population to make that ratio go back down, I would say, below 10%. Because our opinion is that beyond 10% being spent on electricity, and I'm not here talking also about other utilities, because in Eastern Europe people need to pay the bill for heating, right, which can be roughly similar orders of magnitude. They need to pay also for water, wastewater, and so we have found that you can have situations where a quarter of household income is consumed just in those 3 utilities, and that is considered to be quite high. So that is, in a way, the definition and the use that we make of such ratios. definition, in a way, has to reflect the context in which you're working. You know, a lot of the workshop has been focused on the question of just physical access in situations where you do not have any supply of electricity. And then the question becomes what to do and how can that be dealt with. Because the EBRD works in middle-income countries, right, then our, if I could say the word in French, you know, problématique is a bit different, because the problematic is not one of actually extending supply, but it becomes one that if you introduce, for example, renewable energy in the energy mix, you know, how do you manage to ensure that by doing that, you know, you don't end up making energy less affordable to population, therefore, quote unquote, less accessible. Okay, so you're dealing with a variant of the accessibility problem, which is linked to pure financial affordability. We see that for many, many reasons, energy efficiency, in our opinion, is going to be an area of, I would say, a lot of development in the coming year. First of all, a bit of background, you know, why energy efficiency, particularly in relation to Eastern Europe? Because you have a lot of installed capacity, you know, installed capacity of electricity network, of district heating, you know, so of industrial capacity, but a lot of it is quite old, right? And so a lot of it technologically, if you want, you know, needs to be, to a certain extent, you know, more than updated, often, you know, redesigned and reconceived. So the opportunity for reduction of energy consumption and also of reduction of carbon emission linked to energy efficiency is massive in this region. I think also what we see is that given the current economic environment, energy efficiency is a action, an activity, you know, that meets several strategic issues. You know, it relates to energy security. It relates also to the overall energy supply equation, because often there is a sentence, you know, that the cheapest way of producing or having energy available is actually to save it, right, rather than to have to build, you know, new power plants. And also, if you look at it more from an environmental point of view, then energy efficiency also contributes then to, you know, reduction of carbon emissions. So our view, and we've seen that in terms of our own business, you know, we started a very focused approach on this 6 years ago. After 6 years, we've essentially built a portfolio in this area of energy efficiency and renewable energy of about, you know, 500 projects and about 9 billion euros of our investment, right? So total investment probably around 25 billion euros. So, and we've seen the growth of this over time quite significant, because as oil, let's say, as energy prices are rising, the rationale, you know, for energy efficiency is also increasing. So these are, at least in our opinion, the reasons and the direction of why we believe energy efficiency financing will be an area of continued growth in the coming years. I think there you have a certain hierarchy of measures. First and foremost, the big ones, right? The big ones, in my view, are one, linked to energy price, and number two, to the issue of some form of reflection of carbon price, whether it is through taxes, whether it is through market mechanisms, you know. But the point is that, you know, the fundamental policy environment within which operates depends, I think, on the definition of these two parameters. The moment you have energy prices without subsidies, right, and the moment where you have some form of reflection of the carbon impact or the environmental cost, you know, of the use of fossil fuels, then all your questions about incentives, etc., are already to a large extent set. So that's, I would say, at the macro level, right? Now, I think it is fair to say that in the current economic and financial context, you know, in the current negotiations context, these items, you know, will still take a number of years to be worked out, right? And therefore, we go, I would say, to a second level, which is in a way where we have to operate, that even though the policy context remains in a way distorted, we have to see how much can be done within that. And so within that, there are a lot of then other measures that want to think, regulatory measures, definition of standards, for example, which drive very much, energy efficiency, right? Information, because what we find a lot is that, everybody says energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit, the easy thing to do. But, the key question is always, if it is, why is it that, there is so limited activity in this? And a lot of it has to do with information, because the translation of the energy saving into a financial saving is something that you need to do. And that's very much what we work on. And it's amazing to see the reaction, if you want, of CEOs of companies once they understand how the energy saving relates essentially to their financial bottom line, and particularly what the rates of return of investments in this are. So a lot of it is also, I would say, information.